Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today, mostly because we're about to completely transform how you approach learning. Seriously, if you've ever felt like you're just pouring hours and hours into studying, but you're barely keeping your head above water, you are in exactly the right place. So let's dive in and dissect the real science of active learning. Okay, let's jump right into this with a little comparison. Consider these two completely different scenarios. On one side, we have student A. Student A studies for a mere 33 minutes a day, gets a full 8 hours of sleep, actually has time for a social life, and somehow consistently scores in the top 5% of their class. How? Well, they spend their time taking practice tests and teaching concepts to their classmates. Now look at student B. They're grinding for 4 hours every single day, sacrificing sleep, rarely seeing friends, and yet they're struggling to even maintain a B average. They're just filling notebooks with highlighted text and rereading the same chapters over and over. The difference between these two? It's not raw intelligence. It's not even dedication. It is pure strategy. So before we go any further, I want you to do me a quick favor. Do a mental check and honestly rate your current study method from a 1 to a 10. Think about your habits, your typical stress levels before a big test, and your actual retention of the material. Got your number in your head? Okay, cool. Hold on to that, because I'm willing to bet that by the time we finish this explainer, that score, and really, your entire perspective on how to get that score higher is going to drastically change.
All right, moving into section 1, the productivity illusion and the 3 a.m. breakdown.
Think back to that classic 3 a.m. totally panic-induced study session. You know the one. You feel like you're doing everything right. You've been staring at pages for 12 hours straight for some massive psychology exam, but deep down, you know the information is just slipping through your brain like sand. You end up literally drenching your textbooks in highlighter ink until they look like abstract art. We create these perfectly aesthetic notes, we obsess over having the perfect highlighter colors, and we curate the ultimate lo-fi study playlist. But here's the brutal truth. All of that just gives us a false sense of productivity. It feels like hard work, but it yields zero actual retention. We're totally confusing the time spent studying with the amount of knowledge we actually retain.
Now, what's really interesting about this is what we call the consumption trap. This is that deeply ingrained, completely false belief that simply consuming more information automatically equals more learning. We convince ourselves that reading more pages, watching just one more video, or cramming for an extra 2 hours will somehow force the knowledge into our brains. And sadly, our schools reinforce this myth all the time, right? Teachers tell us to study for 3 hours or make sure we review the entire chapter. It equates time served with knowledge gained, and honestly, it is a complete illusion.
We really need to fundamentally shift our mindset to this. Your brain is a muscle, not a sponge. It doesn't just passively absorb information simply because you're staring at a textbook. Think about going to the gym. You don't get stronger by just standing near the dumbbells for 4 hours, right? You get stronger through targeted, active training and then periods of rest. Well, your brain works exactly the same way. It requires resistance to actually grow.
Which brings us to section 2, the math of retention. The underlying formula here is pretty simple. Real learning equals the amount of information times your retention rate. And the funny thing is, we always obsess over that first part, the amount of information. We try to read 100 pages in a sitting, but we completely ignore the multiplier, the actual retention rate. Learning isn't just about the volume of what you take in. It's strictly a product of what you actually keep. So if your retention rate is terrible, your real learning is going to be terrible, literally no matter how many hours you put in.
Let's actually break this math down to put it into perspective. In scenario 1, student 1 studies for 5 grueling hours, but because they're just passively reading, they only retain about 10% of the material. Their real benefit? Basically 30 minutes of actual learning. Now look at student 2. They study for just 1 single hour, but they use smart strategies that give them a 50% retention rate. Their real benefit? Also 30 minutes. Both students ended up with the exact same amount of retained information locked in their brains, but student 1 wasted 4 entire hours of their life.
So the crucial point here is what we're covering in section 3, the power of active learning. Passive studying, things like rereading and highlighting, is essentially trying to fill a leaky bucket. You can keep pouring water in, reading page after page after page, but it's never going to hold. It just leaks right out. Active learning, on the other hand, is about patching the holes first. You're intentionally priming your brain so that when the knowledge finally goes in, it actually stays there. And when you patch those holes, the results are absolutely staggering.
According to the source material, shifting from passive reading to active methods can skyrocket your baseline retention rate from a measly 10% all the way up to 70%. Just imagine getting a 70% return on your study investment instead of 10. Your study time basically gets cut in half, and your grades go from B's and C's to straight A's.
And this brilliantly illustrates our final part, Section 4, Master the Practice Test, the Playbook. This is where we get into the actionable stuff. So here are the first 3 critical steps to this playbook. Step 1, break your study sessions into shorter chunks. Ideally, you want 30 to 60 minutes per subject. Now, step 2 is the absolute game changer. Test yourself first. I know it sounds backwards. Actually, it feels totally uncomfortable at first. But before you even open the textbook, take a practice test completely blind. Grab a blank sheet of paper and write down literally everything you can possibly remember about the topic from memory. Or find a past exam and just attempt it without any notes. It forcefully primes your brain to look for the answers, which leads right into step 3, identify your weak spots. By testing yourself first, you immediately see exactly what you don't know, so you aren't wasting time reviewing the stuff you already have down.
Okay, so once you've identified those weak spots, you attack them using specific active recall tactics. Please do not just reread the chapter on what you missed. Instead, formulate specific questions and force yourself to write out the answers from memory. Try explaining the concepts out loud to a classmate or, even just to your bedroom wall without looking at your notes. Try applying the information to real-life problems to give it actual context. And definitely use flashcards for rapid-fire recall, but treat every single card like a micro-practice test where you absolutely must produce the answer before you flip it. You are forcing your brain to pull information out rather than just passively letting it wash over you. Let's move to the end of the playbook and see how this all builds together into our final 2 steps. Once you've actively recalled the weak spots, the next step is to connect ideas together. Don't let facts just live in isolation in your head. Link them to broader concepts. It makes the information so much easier to retrieve later on. And finally, do a really quick review right before bed. Seriously, sleep is not a waste of time. It is exactly when your brain works to consolidate all of that active learning into your long-term memory. Let your brain do the heavy lifting overnight. So, we've covered the illusion of passive productivity, the brutal math of retention, and the undeniable power of active testing. Think back to that number you rated your study habits at the very beginning of this explainer. Does your habit still deserve its starting score? Because if the answer is no, then congratulations. That is your very first sign that you are ready to level up, patch those holes, and actually make your learning stick. Start testing yourself first, put in that active work, and just watch what happens. Catch you next time.